Hi, I'm Jeff Sharon from UCF Sports Night. You can now watch UCF TV 24 hours a day on Bright House Digital Channel 1.
Hello and welcome to Public Affairs Today. I'm Alicia Callanan Mandigo. This is a show designed to introduce you to public affairs, which is a much more dynamic field than you may realize. On the table today, crime, media, and famous cases. We have two guests today, both from the Department of Criminal Justice and Legal Studies within UCF's College of Health and Public Affairs. We have with us David Fabianic, who teaches about famous criminal cases, and Professor Raymond Surette, who is an expert in crime and media. Welcome, and thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think if we're going to talk about crime and media and famous cases, we kind of have to start with the Caylee Anthony case. It's in Orlando, it's current, and boy, has that become a media frenzy. I've been seeing things go on with this case that I don't remember from other stories I covered as a reporter. So let's talk about that. Why has this case become such a huge explosion?
Well, actually, the Anthony case is a good example of an periodic, ongoing coverage of these sorts of cases. So they're not really as rare as the public is led to believe. And you can pretty much depend on a case being taken up and co-opted by the media and presented in a mini-series format every 3 to 5 years for about the past 100 years.
Is that the cycle, every 3 to 5 years?
There's no firm cycle, but that seems to be how it runs. There's a lot of profit to be made by the coverage of these cases with spin-offs and that, so there's a lot of interest in developing them.
Well, as you mentioned, there are cases similar to this, and and so we don't really hear about a lot of the other cases. This one has become extremely high profile. Where does a case make the turn that it becomes a famous case, which this one I think now qualifies?
I think there's several ways to approach that. To begin with, one is that we have a long list of cases in this country which have been referred to as crimes of the century.
Yes.
Now, nobody has attached that label to the Caylee Anthony case yet, but it isn't over yet. Who knows what they'll do with it? But it's always interesting to note that one generation will regard a particular case as the crime of the century, and 10 years later another one will. And this probably began with the Sacco and Vanzetti case back in the 1920s, early 1920s. And about the same time, or shortly thereafter, that particular trial, the last trial of Sacco and Vanzetti, you had the Loeb and Leopold case, where, again, in that particular case, you had the disappearance of a young boy, a mystery as to who was involved in it. You had a period of time before the mystery was solved. It was a short period of time, several days before they actually made an arrest. And you had very attractive offenders. You had, what made that case unique was, of course, you had two young men who were very, very bright. They were exceptional students. You continue that whole pattern through cases like the Lindbergh case, and then you go into the 40s and you find them in what's the Rosenberg case in the 50s. You find Carol Chessman's case in the 50s, and it continues right up to Oj Simpson and the current cases, whatever they might be. One of the things that assists that, of course, is the media itself, and on two fronts. One, developing technology. It's easier to cover a case now than it was then. It's much easier to sensationalize a case now. You have many more mediums, many more outlets, many more forums, many more people doing shows. about any particular case. And then you have the media that are competing with one another for coverage. And you have people within the media who are trying to make some kind of name for themselves, probably trying to enhance their careers at some point after the event is all over.
Why has this case turned into such a circus? We have the bounty hunter who's coming down and holding memorial services. We have a local rock band that has decided it's going to use this case to launch its career. It's just become bizarre.
Yeah, one of the things that's changed in how the media covers these sorts of cases has been the recent, by recent I mean the last 10 to 20 years, explosion of infotainment. And that has opened up a whole new way of co-opting the criminal justice system. It always went on, and the Charles Lindbergh, Bruno Hoffman trial is a good historical example of it. But infotainment gives the media storylines. And if you look at the history of these sorts of cases that get this sort of massive coverage, one of the commonalities is that they are interesting stories that fit normally into one or three categories. You have sinful rich trials, you have abuse of power and trust trials, and then you have evil stranger trials. This case is also helped by the fact that a lot of the people involved, the characters, if you will, are very telegenic. They come across interesting on the screen. They give, if not informative, at least entertaining interviews, and you have an expanding cast of characters. And if you look at these stories, these trials, as mini-series, it's really the easiest way to sort of understand the process. It's really the co-optation of a live case by the infotainment media, and then developing and delivering it as a mini-series that they're going to run with for as long as they get ratings and interest. What selects one case over another? Some of it is just random timing. Mm-hmm. Slow news, ratings needs, not much else going on in the world, local interest, a cast of characters. One thing that will increase a case's chance of being selected for this sort of co-optation and heavy coverage is if you have prior celebrities, people with prior news value and newsworthiness. The Oj Simpson case, that going on the assumption that he was actually guilty of killing his wife, that was a fairly typical domestic murder. Without the celebrity status of O.J. Simpson, it's unlikely that case would have gotten the coverage. Other ones are elevated because they have ideal victims. Children, pregnant women are easy to cast as the least deserving and the most tragic of victims. So that helps in terms of developing the narratives. And that's really how these cases are covered. They're covered not so much as events, but as developing ongoing entertainment stories. And the scripts are laid out, the sets, everything is sort of provided to the media by the criminal justice system. So it's a high profit, low cost endeavor for the media to cover these sorts of things.
But there are other cases which are similar, and some were big stories and some were not so big stories. Scott Peterson and Mark Hacking, both guys that killed their pregnant, young, beautiful wives. Mm-hmm. Scott Peterson was a huge story. Mark Hacking was less of a story. So I'm wondering where the change comes in. Is it because Scott Peterson held out that he was innocent the whole time and Mark Hacking confessed? OJ always held out that he was innocent. Yeah. Casey Anthony continues to hold out that she is innocent. Is that what sort of propels and perpetuates cases?
I think that contributes to it. I don't know if that necessarily explains the whole thing, but as long as there's a mystery involved, people are going to be interested. I think it's one reason why people are fascinated by the current case here in Orange County. we don't have an answer yet for that. We don't have a, well, that person did it. And with the other cases, at some point they did. Another factor in that might be the fact that some of the cases that got broader coverage were in California. I think the media are a little more active there and probably a little more sensitive to this kind of thing, trying to make a story out of it. I'm guessing on that. Ray can comment on that, but the availability of that media and the experience of that media in covering this kind of thing and massaging it so it becomes a story, I think probably has something to do with it, as opposed to being, you know, located in Orlando or in Phoenix or someplace like that.
Well, it used to be more important location. The technology has advanced to the point where if they have an interest, if there's a public demand, so to speak, they can really give saturation coverage at any point on the planet at this point. One of the common elements that run through it is, besides this idea of mystery, is the image of a predator. Most of these cases involve a predator of some sort, or at least someone who's being constructed as a predator, either a sexual predator, or even some of the financial cases are a financial predator, or a physically violent predator. And they also, the ones that elevate are the ones that are able to give elements where they can bring in the public to sort of aid in the investigation. They set up tip lines, and the public gets drawn into this ongoing investigation that they can be a part of at some level, at least psychologically. So it's sort of like dinner theater in a sense. You can watch the show, and if you want to, you can be part of the show from the level of either driving down to the spontaneous memorial where the body was found, or logging on to the chat rooms, or voting, or calling Nancy Grace with your question. So it's a lot more interactive today than it was. And in cases that probably historically wouldn't have been elevated, today have at least that potential.
So I'm interested in this idea of a random predator that you threw out, because having worked in the newsroom, having been a reporter, there were so many points when I felt it. So my job was to peddle fear. And if you can make people feel like it could happen to you, then they're going to keep watching. So how big of a factor is that?
Well, if there's an icon of media coverage of these sorts of cases, it's a predator icon. It's the most common image that you get, not only in coverage of court cases, but in the entertainment media and programming. Predators are what fascinate us. If you look at the media, you're given 2 points of view in the media. You're allowed to look over the shoulder of predators as they commit crimes, or you're allowed to look over the shoulder of investigators and crime fighters as they hunt down predators. And it's what the public is fascinated with, to be honest.
I think they've also developed sort of an expectational set with regard to that. I think their experience over the years of watching a lot of crime shows on television have given them sort of a set of categories in which they can view the progress of an investigation and a crime. Now, you have something that's attenuated, like the Caylee Anthony case. They were in on the first announcement that there was a disappearance. Then the extraordinary circumstances began to occur. They know that there's an investigation. They know that there's supposed to be some sort of conclusion to that investigation. Certain things are supposed to happen. And they're watching to see if they do, or they are guessing that where is this child? What were the circumstances of the disappearance? How can we tell that the mother was lying or telling the truth? Those kinds of things. They play the game, either vicariously or by calling into the Nancy Grace show or Comedy Hour or whatever it is she runs. They do that.
Yeah, the oldest storyline in the media for crime and justice is crime, pursuit, and capture. Mm-hmm. And that's what the coverage of these sorts of cases just follows that trail. And it makes it an easy formatting and decision as to, you know, how you're going to set up the story, what you're going to cover, how you're going to report it. The concern is, there's a term I use called the Backwoods Law, which is that whatever is the reality of crime and justice out in the world, what you're going to get out of the media is the opposite of that. So the rarest events in the real world are going to be the most common events that you hear and see in the media. Mm-hmm. And these sorts of cases follow through. It's why, you know, a mother killing her child is extremely rare in the real world, and why when it occurs or is accused of occurring is going to get a lot of interest. The downstream problem with that is that it does generate fear among the audience, and people enjoy being made fearful. It's why we like roller coasters and rides such as that in a controlled situation. And that's, you know, obviously getting that through the media is a controlled way of being made concerned in that. The issue becomes when that translates, and there is some evidence that it does translate into policy support. So people start formulating their criminal justice policies and what they think needs to be done about crime in society based on this worst case, predatory, animalistic killer, rather than the more typical type of offender that actually exists out there, which is going to be a property offender.
Which is also sometimes just headline information, not actual in-depth information. One of the things that I'd like to talk about is how the media affects investigations. When you have a case that is in the middle of an investigation and it's getting intense media coverage, the way OJ did, the way Caylee Anthony has the Gainesville murders. I have a personal friend, a fellow reporter, who got so caught up in this idea of being the one to break the case that, you know, they arrested the wrong suspect. And I don't doubt that reporting contributed to that error on the part of law enforcement. How big of a deal is that?
Well, the media on the plus side can be helpful in terms of if somebody is being looked, you know, if there's a search on. So in terms of getting the image of the child out there, getting tips called in. So it's not all negative. You would hope the police would be professional enough to be able to conduct their investigations and not be influenced by reporting. So in terms of the Gainesville situation, I put more onus on the police that they are actually swayed by reporting to arrest somebody than I do on the reporter. I mean, the press are going to do what the press, you know, do, and that is to report stories and not to get scooped and to put information out there.
One of the things that is necessary when you have an investigation of crimes of this sort is that you have a very good public relations person in a police department, somebody that can deal with the media in an organized, coherent manner, somebody that they trust. Smaller departments don't have that luxury. One of the things that comes into play when you have the recognition you have a serial killer, for example, in an area, one of the things that has always been made some departments very reluctant to admit that was because they knew they were going to get into some kind of media frenzy the moment they announced it. Mm-hmm. And so that becomes a problem. If you look at how crimes are basically solved, if you look at it from the standpoint of the prosecution, what the prosecution needs, what the state needs to proceed, they're going to need one of four things, one or more of four things. They're going to need a confession, which they don't have frequently. Now, in the hacking case, they did get one, yes. and a few others they have. But in the Caylee Anthony case, you do not have a confession, so people are waiting for that, if that comes. The physical evidence, which becomes very important in many ways because it tends to be the one thing that becomes reliable. Witnesses, you have no witnesses in the Caylee Anthony case. The witnesses to the crime. You have witnesses to events and circumstances which ultimately will probably lead to a circumstantial case. and you have what's called consciousness of guilt, which in the case of Kaylee Anthony, there's a ton of things that people can point to. People outside are looking in, they're seeing one thing. The prosecution, the state's seeing another. What they're looking for are one of these four, because that's the way you're going to win a case if you have to go to trial with it.
Mm-hmm. So then, when we talk about how potentially law enforcement allowed itself to get misdirected in the Gainesville murders because of media attention, didn't we see a similar thing happen in Atlanta with the bombing during the Olympics and the wrong suspect was arrested? Can we look at the media as a culprit, because that's a bigger city with a more sophisticated police department?
I doubt that in Atlanta, I don't think the press had the same impact that they had in the Gainesville situation. The people who made the big mistake in the Atlanta situation were the FBI, mm-hmm. and they based their arrest on some profiling information, which was wrong. Plain wrong, and they also were very premature. In the media at that point, once they found out who that suspect was, what they did to that poor person made it very difficult, would have made it very difficult to actually proceed much beyond an arrest, because it was so prejudicial. I think any good defense attorney could have raised all kinds of questions with it.
Okay.
In some of these cases, the media also have more resources that they can immediately put onto running down witnesses, following up on leads. For the media, it's the only case they're dealing with, particularly when you're dealing with large city police departments. It might be one of 20 or 30 ongoing murders that they're
mm-hmm.
currently dealing with.
Right.
So I think you saw that with the Oj trial. The media clearly had more resources and money and time, and were willing to put the effort on following up all sorts of leads. So they often got the witnesses and interviewed them and had them on the air before the investigators had a chance.
I want to just quickly touch on if there are famous cases, historical cases, in which the media played a role in breaking the case.
Actually, finding the perpetrator.
We know we can rule D.B. Cooper out, right?
Yeah. I can't think of any that are regarded as famous where the media have been first in identifying a suspect or an actual offender. Can you?
No.
I don't think so.
So playing a positive role in crime, I guess, is still something that's to come from the media, something to look forward to.
There was one
perhaps.
person who did a study of the serial killers who were sending letters to the local press. Mm-hmm. And this person, after studying the utility and usefulness of those sort of interactions, didn't particularly find that particularly helpful in solving the case either.
Interesting. Well, I'm afraid we're out of time, but I want to thank you both for joining us. This was a really interesting topic that I think we could discuss a lot further, and hopefully we'll get an additional opportunity to do that. So I've been talking with Professor David Fabianic and Professor Raymond Surette, both from the Department of Criminal Justice and Legal Studies within UCF's College of Health and Public Affairs. And that's it for now. I'm Alicia Callanan Mandigo. Thanks for watching Public Affairs Today.